The baby, barely able to sit up on her own, looks out at the world with wide, trusting eyes. She giggles as she touches the soft fur of the puppy beside her, who, despite his small size and vulnerability, watches over her with an unspoken loyalty. Their bond is immediate, pure, and unbroken by time or circumstance. But that fragile world is about to change. A storm rages outside, its thunder clapping like a warning. The baby's father is momentarily distracted, and the puppy, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, barks nervously. The baby's small hand reaches out, tugging at the puppy's fur in reassurance, as if saying, "It's okay." But then, without warning, the front door slams open. The storm has driven an intruder, a dangerous, unpredictable force, into the house. The puppy immediately positions himself between the baby and the threat, his heart pounding with fear and determination. The baby clutches the puppy's fur, instinctively trusting him, and in this moment, the puppy realizes something that will change everything. He must protect her, at all costs. Ella's room was a sanctuary of warmth and peace. The soft glow of the evening sun filtered through the curtains, casting golden beams over the crib where she lay, wrapped snugly in her favorite blanket. Beside her, Milo, the puppy, lay sprawled out on the floor, his small body curled in the fetal position, eyes half closed in deep contentment. His tail flicked lazily, a sign that, despite his exhaustion from a day filled with playful mischief, he still remained ever watchful. Ella's tiny hand, almost imperceptibly, reached out toward him. Her fingers grazed his soft fur, and she smiled, her innocent giggles filling the room. The connection between the two was pure, unspoken, almost magical. Milo, in his gentle, protective way, nudged closer to her. He stretched out his body just enough to touch her, his warmth offering a silent comfort. There was something deeply special about the way Ella and Milo communicated without words. They both understood the other's needs, their emotions, their fears, and their desires. Milo would nuzzle into her side, sensing when she was restless, or when she simply needed to be close to him. And Ella, still so small, her world limited to the crib and the safe walls of her home, seemed to know that her little dog was her protector, her constant companion in this big world. It was clear that even though Ella had only been in the world for a few months, she already knew Milo in a way that felt like a bond formed over lifetimes. Her baby hands tugged at the fabric of his fur, in the same way she would later pull at her mother's sleeve or father's finger. Milo responded to her with nothing but love and devotion. But there was something else, something that ran deeper. It was an invisible thread between them, woven from affection, empathy, and trust, that tied their fates together. It was as if each of them instinctively knew they had found something precious in the other. Ella found comfort in Milo's presence, and Milo, despite his small size, found purpose in protecting her. It was moments like these that made the house feel alive with quiet warmth, a peaceful rhythm that lulled them into a sense of security. In these still moments, there was no fear, no worry. The peaceful rhythm of Ella's world was shattered one stormy afternoon. The clouds overhead had grown thick and heavy, and the once calm winds now howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows. Ella's father, Mark, sat on the couch, his attention fixed on the weather outside. It had been a long, stressful day. Work had kept him on edge, and he was grateful to finally be home, safe with his family. He smiled at the thought of Ella and Milo, his eyes softening as he looked toward the playroom, where his daughter and the dog were enjoying their time together. The wind howled louder, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room, followed by the sound of thunder that rumbled deep in the sky. Milo, who had been lying next to the crib, suddenly lifted his head, ears standing straight up. His body tensed, and a low growl vibrated from deep within him. The baby, sensing Milo's unease, stirred in her crib, her tiny fingers gripping the edges of her blanket. "Milo?" Mark called softly, his eyes narrowing as he saw the dog's body language shift. Milo stood up, pacing around the crib, his eyes darting toward the door. The protective instinct had kicked in. There was a loud bang against the front door, a sound that could only mean one thing. Someone had slammed into it. Milo barked furiously, the hairs along his back standing on end. He darted toward the door, positioning himself between it and Ella's crib. His heart raced. He could feel something was wrong. His instinct told him that something or someone was a threat. The door rattled again, and then, with a sudden force, it flew open. The storm had driven a figure, a man, into the house. The man was drenched, his clothes soaked with rain, his face obscured by a shadow. But Milo's sharp eyes saw the glint of something sinister in the man's hand. A knife, gleaming under the faint light of the hallway. Mark's heart froze. He stood up, rushing toward the crib where Ella slept, blissfully unaware of the danger that had just entered their home. But Milo, ever vigilant, was already moving, his body positioned between the stranger and the baby. He bared his teeth, his growls growing louder, fiercer, warning the intruder to stay back. The man paused, sizing up the small dog. He sneered, clearly unfazed by the threat of a puppy. He took a step forward. That's when Milo lunged. He wasn't thinking, he just knew that he had to protect Ella at all costs. He bit the man's ankle, causing him to stagger back. But it wasn't enough. The stranger kicked Milo away with brutal force, sending the puppy crashing into the wall. Milo yelped, his body aching. But he refused to back down. He pushed himself up, wobbled on his feet, and barked, desperate for Mark to notice. Ella, Mark yelled, rushing to his daughter's side. His heart pounded as he scooped her into his arms. But the man was too close now, too close to the crib. "Stay away from my daughter," Mark shouted, his voice thick with fear. But the man didn't listen. He reached for Ella, his hand just inches away from the baby's soft skin. Milo, despite the pain he was in, wasn't done. His eyes burned with a primal need to protect. With all the strength he could muster, he launched himself at the intruder again, sinking his teeth into the man's leg. The man grunted in pain, backing away. His foot slipped on the wet floor as he stumbled, losing his footing. In that brief moment, Mark rushed forward, pulling Ella away from the danger and pushing the man out the door with a final shove. "Get out," Mark yelled. The stranger, realizing he had lost, scrambled away, disappearing into the storm. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. The storm outside had nothing on the chaos that had just unfolded in the house. Milo lay crumpled on the floor, bloodied and bruised but still breathing, still loyal. Mark kneeled beside him, his hands trembling as he checked the puppy's injuries. Milo whimpered, his tail weakly wagging, as he looked up at Mark with eyes that conveyed nothing but pure devotion. He had saved Ella, and now, he needed saving himself. Mark's heart was heavy with gratitude and fear. Milo's bravery had saved his daughter, but it had come at a cost. Milo had risked everything for Ella, and Mark knew, in that moment, that the bond between them was unbreakable. No matter what, no matter how bad things got, Milo would always protect Ella. He was a part of their family. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Mark whispered as he cradled the dog's head in his hands. "You saved." Milo's eyes fluttered, and though his body was exhausted, he managed to give one final nuzzle against Mark's hand, a silent, tired confirmation that he had done what he needed to do. There was no need for words, no need for anything more. He had saved Ella, and in his heart, he knew that his mission was complete. But the danger was not over. The man had left, but the fear of what might happen next lingered in the air. Mark picked up the phone and dialed 911. But as he did, his thoughts were already turning toward what had to come next. He had to keep them safe. Milo needed help, and Ella needed protection. The storm outside raged on, but within their walls, a new chapter was about to unfold. And in that moment, the bond between them all, father, daughter, and dog, grew even deeper, more unbreakable, because this journey was just beginning. The days following Milo's return home were filled with a quiet, steady rhythm. The immediate chaos had subsided, and now, Mark focused on healing, not just his family's physical wounds, but the emotional ones as well. It wasn't just Milo who needed rest and care. Ella, too, had been impacted, her once serene world now shaded by the shadow of danger. Mark had noticed a change in Ella, something subtle but undeniably there. She was clingier, more hesitant. Her small hands, which had once reached out for the world with unbridled curiosity, now grasped for him or for Milo at the slightest noise. Her laughter, while still frequent, seemed to carry a tremor, a hint of uncertainty she hadn't had before. It wasn't easy to see his little girl so affected, but Mark knew it was something they would work through together. Each day, they focused on small victories. Ella had always been a quiet baby, preferring to observe her world rather than dive headfirst into it. But now, she clung to the familiar things, her favorite toys, her crib, and most importantly, Milo had always been her steady companion, and though he had been through his own trauma, his loyalty to her remained unwavering. The first time Ella reached out to touch Milo after his return was a moment of profound simplicity. She sat on the floor, surrounded by her toys, her eyes fixed on the puppy who had slowly but surely regained his strength. His limping had become less pronounced, his tail wagging with more energy, though he still rested frequently. His wounds had healed, but the emotional scars were slower to fade. Ella's small hands reached out to him, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, as she stroked his soft fur. Milo let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into her touch. It was a gesture of trust, Ella's, as much as it was Milo's. For the first time since the break-in, Ella smiled, a smile so pure, so innocent, it melted Mark's heart. "I'm here, Ella," Mark whispered softly, his voice barely audible as he watched the scene from the doorway. "You're safe now, both of you." Milo gave him a slow, knowing look. It was as if the dog understood everything that had transpired in those fraught days, and in a way, he did. Milo had lived through the trauma of that night, and he had come out on the other side, not just as a protector, but as something more. A guardian, a friend, a member of their family in a way that transcended species. The days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Milo's presence in Ella's life continued to provide a sense of security. She began to play again, though she remained closer to Milo than she ever had before. The bond between them was now undeniable, a tether that anchored both of them to safety, to love, and to a future that felt more certain than ever. It wasn't just Ella who was healing, though. Milo, despite his seemingly constant role as a protector, was finding his own way back to the family. The trauma he had faced, the physical pain, the fear and the uncertainty of that night, had taken a toll on him. But there was a resilience in the little dog that couldn't be measured in the same way you would gauge the recovery of a human being. Milo healed, not just through rest, but through love. One afternoon, as the sun streamed in through the windows, Mark and Ella were sitting together on the couch, watching as Milo lay at their feet, his eyes half closed in the comfort of home. For a while no one spoke. It was a rare moment of stillness, and it felt like the weight of everything, of the intrusion, of the fear, of the tension, had lifted, if only for a brief moment. Milo stirred, his ears twitching at the sound of a bird outside. Mark could see the quiet weariness in the dog's eyes as his head turned toward the window, but it was no longer the panic of that first night. Milo's body tensed, but it was a small, controlled response, one that came with the understanding that he was no longer powerless. His alertness was part of what kept him and the family safe, but it was also a sign that he was not consumed by fear anymore. He had faced danger, and now he was stronger for it. "Good boy, Milo," Mark murmured, rubbing the dog's head. Milo turned his head toward him, eyes softening with recognition. The simple affection in that moment spoke volumes. It was as though Milo understood that this was his home, and he had earned his place here, not just through his bravery, but through his love. Ella, seeing the exchange, giggled and reached out for Milo, her small hands once again pulling at his fur with a gentle touch. Milo's tail wagged, and his eyes, though still carrying the memory of the danger they had faced, now shone with a quiet confidence. In his eyes was a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and a love that refused to be broken. "Both of you are my heroes," Mark whispered to them, his heart full. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, their world had shifted. Ella had grown into a more secure, more trusting little girl, and Milo had grown into the protector he was always meant to be. But there was something deeper at play, something that went beyond just the roles they had filled in each other's lives. They had created a family, a true family, forged through hardship, love, and sacrifice. As the weeks rolled on, the healing continued. The storm that had raged both outside and within the family had passed, and in its wake was something stronger. In the days that followed, Mark began to take small steps to bring a sense of normalcy back into their lives. The house, while still scarred by the memories of the break-in, was filled with the sounds of life again. Ella's laughter, Milo's soft barks, the hum of the washer and dryer, the clinking of dishes in the kitchen, all of it spoke to the recovery that had taken place. But it wasn't just the external world that was healing. Mark could see it in the way Ella had started to smile again, really her laughter had regained its lilt, its sparkle. She was no longer just clutching at Milo for comfort, but rather she was learning to reach out for the world again, always knowing Milo would be there to anchor her when she needed him most. She would crawl to the door and peek outside, always with Milo at her side, her hand resting gently on his back. It was as though she understood that they were safe together, that she could face the world with him by her side. Mark also saw a new side of Milo. The puppy had always been full of energy and playfulness, but now he had a wisdom in his eyes, a quiet understanding of his role within this family. His loyalty was unwavering, his love unconditional, but it was also tempered with a deeper, more measured calm, as though he had come to understand the value of the peace they now shared. He was not just a protector, but a guide for Ella, a teacher of sorts, showing her how to trust, how to love, and how to face the world with courage. Mornings were still the best time. The soft light of the early hours filtered through the windows, casting a peaceful glow over the room. It was during these quiet moments that Mark often found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the journey they had been through. He thought about how far they had come, how much they had all grown. Milo had become more than just a pet. He was family. Ella, though still so young, had learned the true meaning of love and trust. And Mark had learned in the most profound way that the love of a dog, of a true companion, could heal even the deepest wounds. One morning, as Mark sat with a cup of coffee, watching Milo and Ella play together on the floor, he realized something simple but profound. They were no longer living in the aftermath of the storm. They had emerged from it. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled them. Their bond was the lifeline that held them together, stronger than ever. He smiled watching as Ella crawled toward Milo, her tiny fingers reaching for him with complete trust. Milo, ever faithful, nudged her gently with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here, I'll always be here." And in that moment, Mark knew beyond a doubt that nothing could break the bond they had forged. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about love. It was about family. It had been months since the break-in. The season had changed from the cold bite of winter to the bright warmth of early spring, and with it, the world outside their home was beginning to reflect a new beginning. The trees once bare were now blooming with vibrant flowers, and the air had a freshness to it that felt almost magical. For Mark, this new season felt like the perfect metaphor for what was happening inside their home. They were all emerging from the darkness, slowly and steadily, into the light of healing. Mark had been hesitant to let his guard down fully after the break-in. He had kept watch over their home more than ever, installing additional locks on the doors, ensuring the windows were secure, and even purchasing a security system. Every night before bed, he would check on Ella and Milo, making sure they were safe, his mind racing with protective thought. He couldn't help it. The fear from that night still lurked in his subconscious, even if he tried to push it away. But as time passed, Mark began to feel a shift. It wasn't sudden, but there were moments, small quiet moments that told him things were changing. The first time he realized that he wasn't looking over his shoulder as much anymore was a small victory. The tension in his chest began to loosen, little by little, as he saw his family moving forward. Ella, too, had made incredible strides. The trauma from the break-in had caused her to retreat into herself for a while, but she was becoming more confident every day. She began to reach for the world again, crawling eagerly toward new toys, new places, and even new people. Her laughter, which had once been shadowed by the memory of fear, was now genuine. It bubbled up freely, a sound that warmed Mark's heart every time. Milo's healing process, both physical and emotional, was slow. His injuries had been serious, and while his body had recovered, his spirit needed more time. The trauma of the break-in had changed him too. The once carefree puppy who had jumped at every opportunity for a game of fetch or a playful chase now seemed more reserved. But there was something deeper at play here, something that made Mark's heart swell with pride and gratitude. Milo's love for Ella had never wavered. He was still the protective dog he had always been, but now he seemed even more in tune with her needs, sensing when she needed comfort or when she wanted to explore. His presence had become an anchor for her, steady and unwavering. One particular morning, Mark found himself lost in thought as he watched Milo and Ella in the living room. The dog had settled down on his usual spot by the window, his eyes half closed as he basked in the sun. Ella, now able to walk with the help of a little push toy, was toddling around the room, her small steps tentative but determined. She had made it a habit to stop every few steps to look back at Milo, seeking his reassurance as she made her way across the room. Milo's ears perked up when she glanced in his direction, and his tail gave a slow, rhythmic wag. It was a simple gesture, but Mark felt the weight of its meaning. In that moment, Milo wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline for Ella. She had found her way in the world again, and it was with Milo by her side, her steadfast protector, guiding her forward. Mark smiled softly to himself. He realized that in many ways, he was learning from them, learning from the way they had both healed and grown.
He had spent so much time trying to protect them, trying to fix everything, that he had forgotten the importance of allowing things to heal naturally. Like the trees outside that had slowly blossomed in the spring, their family was blooming again, slowly but surely. As spring turned into summer, Mark began to notice that his home felt different, lighter, warmer. The lingering tension had dissolved, replaced by an air of peaceful contentment. There was still the occasional moment of unease, especially when the weather was stormy or when they were in unfamiliar places. But Mark saw how quickly Milo would respond to Ella's slightest hint of discomfort. Milo's instinct to protect her was unwavering, and his presence had become a source of peace for both of them.
One evening, as the sun began to set, Mark took Ella and Milo outside into the backyard. It was a warm, golden evening, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh grass and flowers. Ella, her cheeks flushed with excitement, clapped her hands as she watched the puppy chase after a bouncing ball. Milo, despite the residual limp in his step, ran with abandon, his tail wagging furiously. Ella let out a squeal of joy and began to toddle after him, her small legs moving as fast as they could carry her. Mark, watching from the porch, could see the joy radiating from both of them. The image of his daughter and the dog playing together, free and full of life, was a stark contrast to the night they had endured so many months ago. In the quiet, soft glow of the setting sun, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude for what they had now. Yes, they had been through something horrible, but they had come out the other side stronger, more connected, more alive. Milo paused for a moment and turned to look at Ella, who had stopped to catch her breath. When their eyes met, Mark could see the depth of the bond between them. It wasn't just about the protection anymore. It was about something far more profound. Milo had become a part of Ella's world in a way that no one else could. He had become a source of comfort, security, and even joy. And Ella, with her boundless energy and curiosity, had become a source of love and purpose for Milo. They needed each other in ways that words could never fully capture. Mark joined them in the yard, kneeling down beside Ella as she picked up a stick and handed it to Milo. Milo, ever the obedient dog, took it gently in his mouth and sat down beside her, his eyes soft with affection. "You're my good boy, Milo," Ella said, her voice small but filled with a sweetness that made Mark's heart swell. Milo nudged her with his nose, his tail thumping on the ground as he looked up at Mark, as if seeking his approval. Mark smiled and gave the dog a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Yeah, you are, buddy," Mark said softly. "You're the best." In that moment, Mark realized that this was what healing looked like. It wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about finding peace. Even in the aftermath, it was about letting go of the fear and embracing the love that had always been there. Ella and Milo had shown him the way, teaching him that healing didn't have to be rushed. It was a process, a slow unfolding that took time, patience, and trust. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them sat together in the grass, their backs against the cool earth. Ella leaned into Milo's side, her tiny fingers tangled in his fur, while Mark leaned back on his arms, gazing up at the sky. The sound of birds chirping and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze filled the air. It was a moment of peace, a moment of connection, and in that quiet, Mark realized how far they had come. They had survived the storm, but more than that, they had grown together. The next few months brought with them a renewed sense of purpose for their family. Ella, now walking confidently, began to explore the world around her more independently. She would walk hand in hand with Mark, or with Milo trotting beside her, to the park, where they would sit on the swings together or have picnics under the shade of a large oak tree. Milo, ever watchful, kept a close eye on her, his protective instincts always in play, but his demeanor was relaxed, grounded in the newfound tranquility of their lives. For Mark, these outings were a reminder of just how much their world had changed. The man who had once felt like his world was collapsing in on him had found a new peace, a peace that came not from the absence of danger, but from the presence of love. His love for Ella, for Milo, and for the life they had built together was the bedrock of his newfound resilience. One afternoon, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Mark found himself reflecting on the journey they had taken. He thought about how, even in the darkest moments, they had each other to lean on. He thought about how Milo had saved Ella's life, and in doing so, had saved them. He had been the protector, the unsung hero, but Mark knew that he was much more than that. Milo was family. He was the lifeline that had kept them together when everything else felt uncertain. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, The bond between Ella, Milo, and Mark continued to grow. The house was filled with laughter again, the tension long gone. They had weathered the storm together, and now in its aftermath, they were stronger than ever. And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the horizon, Mark knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. With Milo by their side, and with the love they had for one another, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The sound of birds chirping filled the air as Mark stood in the garden, his hands resting on the wooden fence. It was early morning, and the light of dawn painted the world in shades of orange and pink. The air was still cool from the night, but the warmth of the sun began to seep in, promising a beautiful day. But as Mark stood there, his thoughts were far from the calm beauty of the moment. The unease that had settled in after the encounter with the stranger lingered in the back of his mind, an unshakable presence that seemed to cloud his ability to fully relax. It had been 2 weeks since that strange man had appeared at the gate. The fear he felt during that moment still hadn't completely dissipated, but life had gone on. Ella was still growing, learning new things every day. Milo, though more subdued than before, was still the fierce protector he had always been. But Mark knew the balance of their lives had shifted. The intrusion, though it hadn't escalated into anything worse, had rattled something deep inside him. The feeling of vulnerability, of knowing that his family could be threatened at any time, was a difficult one to shake off. The worst part wasn't the moment of danger it was the aftermath, the realization that despite their best efforts, they couldn't keep the world out. There was no amount of security, no amount of preparation, that could guarantee they would be safe from harm forever. And as a father, that was a heavy realization. His instincts were to protect, to keep them both safe, to shelter them from all the dangers of the world. But the truth was, no one could shield their loved ones forever. Eventually, the world would find its way in. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see Ella toddling toward him, her small hands grasping a dandelion she had picked from the yard. Her face was lit with a bright smile, her eyes shining with that innocent curiosity he had come to love so much. She was wearing her little purple dress, her hair tied in two messy pigtails, and her cheeks were flushed from running around outside. "Daddy," she said, holding out the dandelion to him. "Flower." Mark bent down to her level, his heart swelling at the sight of her. He reached for the flower and smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said softly. "It's beautiful." Ella giggled and took a step closer, her little arms outstretched. Without hesitation, Mark scooped her up into his arms, holding her close. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body fitting perfectly against his. He held her tightly, feeling the warmth of her presence, the sweet scent of her hair. It was in moments like these that he realized just how precious time with her was. Milo, ever the watchful protector, trotted up beside them. His ears were perked, and his eyes scanned the yard for any potential danger. He had always been a calming presence for Ella, and the two of them had created an unspoken understanding. Milo was the steady companion, the one who kept Ella safe and grounded, while Ella brought joy and love into the dog's life. Together, they made a team that Mark knew was unbreakable. The stillness of the morning was disrupted by the familiar sound of a car engine approaching. Mark's eyes flicked toward the driveway, where a car was slowly pulling up to the house. His heart skipped a beat, the old instinct to protect flaring up as his gaze sharpened. The car was unfamiliar, but it wasn't the first time they had received unexpected visitors. The car came to a stop, and the door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit and tie. He had dark hair and a stern expression, and as he walked toward the house, Mark's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. This wasn't someone from the neighborhood, and there was something in the way the man moved that made Mark uneasy. "Milo," Mark whispered, his voice low. The dog immediately stood up straighter, his hackles raised as he watched the stranger. Ella, still in Mark's arms, shifted slightly, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Milo's gaze never left the man. "Who is that, Daddy?" Ella asked, her voice small but curious. "I don't know, sweetie," Mark replied, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. He glanced down at Milo. "Stay close." The man approached the front door, and Mark, still holding Ella, stepped forward to greet him. The man didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. His eyes were focused ahead, his expression serious. As he reached the door, he extended his hand to Mark. "Good morning," the man said, his tone professional. "I'm Tom Matthews. I'm here to speak with you about your property." Mark shook his hand, his mind racing. He tried to keep his voice steady as he replied, "Property? What do you mean? I represent a company that's interested in purchasing your land, Tom explained, his voice measured. We've been tracking this area for some time and believe it would be ideal for development. We'd like to discuss an offer with you. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had heard about companies coming into neighborhoods and making offers for land, but he hadn't expected it to happen to him. His mind flashed back to the break-in, the strange man, and the sense of vulnerability he had been feeling. He wasn't sure if this was a coincidence or if there was more going on here. We're not looking to sell, Mark said firmly, his protective instincts still on high alert. This is our home. We have no interest in any offers. Tom's expression didn't change, but Mark could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. I understand, but you might want to consider it. The offer we're making is generous. It would give you the freedom to move elsewhere, somewhere safer, more comfortable. There's a lot of potential for the area to change. Mark's grip on Ella tightened slightly, and Milo stepped closer, sensing the shift in Mark's emotions. This is our home, Mark repeated, his voice unwavering. We've been through enough already. I'm not selling. Not now. Not ever. Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. I'll leave you with the information, he said, handing Mark a folder. I'll be back in a few days to follow up. But think about it. This could be a good opportunity for you and your family. Mark didn't respond, but the man didn't wait for one. He turned on his heel and walked back to his car, the engine starting with a low hum. Mark stood there, holding Ella, watching as the car pulled away. His mind was spinning. What had just happened? Why had this man come here? And why had he been so insistent? Daddy, who was that? Ella asked, her small voice tinged with confusion. He was just someone trying to buy our house, sweetheart, Mark explained, his voice steady but his heart racing. But we're not going anywhere. This is our home. Milo, sensing the unease in Mark, nudged his hand with his nose, offering the same quiet comfort he always did. Mark scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for his presence. He wasn't sure why the visit had unsettled him so much, but he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time they would face challenges. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind. The strange man's visit, the unsettling offer to sell their home. He had wanted to brush it off, but something about it felt wrong. The way the man had spoken, the subtle pressure in his voice, it was as if he knew something Mark didn't. He glanced at Ella, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib, her tiny hands curled in the comfort of her blanket. Milo was lying at the foot of her bed, his head resting on his paws, always vigilant. Mark's heart swelled with love and protectiveness. This was his family. This was their home. He wasn't going to let anything take that from them. The next morning, Mark made up his mind. He wasn't going to let fear control his life anymore. He had been through too much to let a stranger intimidate him into giving up the place where they had rebuilt their lives. He would fight for this home, for this family, no matter what. As he stepped outside with Milo later that morning, Mark knew that the challenges ahead would test them. But with Milo by his side, and with Ella's love and trust guiding him, he felt ready. It was time to stop running from the unknown and face it head. Come on, Milo, Mark said softly, looking down at the dog. Let's protect what's ours. And with that, they walked into the unknown, together, stronger than ever, united by love and the determination to keep their family safe. The day after the strange man's visit, Mark could hardly shake the unsettling feeling in his gut. His mind was consumed with questions. Why had Tom Matthews been so insistent on buying their property? What was his real motive? And why had he seemed so confident that Mark would sell? It was more than just a random offer. Mark could feel it deep in his bones. Something wasn't right. He hadn't shared his concerns with Ella yet, knowing she would only sense his anxiety and ask questions she was too young to understand. But he couldn't shake the world had already taken so much from them. The break-in, the trauma, the fear. He couldn't let that happen again. Not to his family, not to his daughter. As Mark stood in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, Milo lay quietly on the floor by the back door, his ears flicking every so often. The dog had been unusually quiet since the visit, as though he too sensed something off. His protective instincts were always sharp, but today, Milo seemed more attuned to Mark's unease than ever. Hey, boy, Mark said softly, running a hand over the dog's back. What do you think's going on? Milo looked up at him with those soulful brown eyes, his gaze understanding but unreadable. Mark scratched behind his ears, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed a plan, He needed to understand what was happening. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the world was closing in on them, as if they were trapped in an invisible web of danger. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed on the countertop. It was a message from a local realtor he'd been in touch with about expanding their house. They had planned to renovate, but he hadn't expected to hear back so soon. Curiosity piqued. Mark opened the message. Just wanted to inform you that someone came by yesterday asking about purchasing your land. I thought it was strange, considering you haven't mentioned selling, but I wanted to let you know. The realtor had attached the name and contact information of the person who'd inquired. Mark's pulse quickened as he recognized the name, Tom Matthews. This was no coincidence. Mark felt his heart race. He had to act quickly. He couldn't just sit by and let someone like Tom Matthews push him around. His instincts told him that Tom wasn't just a businessman. He was someone with an agenda, someone who wanted more than just land. Mark could feel it in his gut. There was something shady about this whole thing, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Over the next few days, Mark took matters into his own hands. He started researching Tom Matthews, using every resource he could find: public records, news articles, and even local community forums. What he uncovered only added to his suspicion. Tom Matthews wasn't just a local businessman. He was a well-connected real estate developer with a history of acquiring land at low prices, often through underhanded tactics. His company, Matthews Enterprises, was known for bulldozing small communities to make way for high-rise apartments, shopping centers, and luxury development. The more Mark read, the more his unease grew. This wasn't just about a random property sale. Tom Matthews wanted something, and Mark had a sinking feeling that whatever it was far worse than just financial gain. Mark couldn't let this man get to. He had to protect his family and their home. But the reality was that Tom had power, money, connections, and influence. Mark, on the other hand, had only one thing: his family. But that was all he needed. Mark decided he had to confront Tom head-on. He needed answers. He needed to know what was really at stake. And he wasn't going to wait for Tom to come back to him. Mark would go straight to him. A week later, Mark found himself standing outside a sleek office building in the downtown area. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the scent of rain, and a light drizzle fell from the gray clouds. The city felt more distant than it ever had before. There was a disconnect now, a barrier between Mark's small, peaceful world and the chaotic, bustling forces that seemed to be closing in on him. Tom Matthews's office was on the top floor of the building. Mark had made an appointment with his secretary, and though he hadn't mentioned the reason for his visit, he had made it clear that he intended to speak with Tom directly. No more games, no more polite exchanges. He needed to hear the truth. As Mark stepped into the elevator, his mind, he wasn't sure what he would say to Tom once he got to his office. What could he say? The man was clearly not someone who cared about boundaries. He was ruthless, and Mark could feel it in every fiber of his being. But Mark also knew one thing: he would not back down. When the elevator doors opened, Mark found himself in a sleek, modern lobby. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, but there was no warmth in her eyes. She was used to people like Mark. People with questions. People who couldn't see the bigger picture. "I have an appointment with Mr. Matthews," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "Of course, Mr. Reese," the receptionist said, standing up. "He's expecting you. Please go right in." Mark nodded, his steps steady as he walked toward Tom's office. The door was slightly ajar, and he knocked once before entering. Tom Matthews was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, his fingers steepled in front of him. He looked up when Mark entered, his smile tight and rehearsed. "Miss Reese, thank you for coming in," Tom said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "I'm sure you're curious about the offer I made on your land." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I don't want your offer," he said bluntly, standing tall. "I want to know why you're really here. Why are you so interested in my property?" Tom raised an eyebrow, his gaze calculating. "I can see you're not the type to beat around the bush. I respect that." "Cut the nonsense," Mark snapped. "I've done my research. I know who you are, and I know what you've done to communities like mine. You've bulldozed homes, displaced families, and built high-rises for the rich. But this isn't just about business for you, is it? What's really going on here, Tom?" For a brief moment, Tom's mask slipped. His calm exterior faltered, and Mark saw a flicker of something dangerous. Tom leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "You've done your homework," Tom said, his voice cold. "I'll give you credit for that. But the truth is, Miss Reese, you don't have a choice in the matter. You're going to sell me your land. One way or another." Mark felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "It's simple. I've been working with local authorities, and I have the support I need to take what I want. Your home, your property, it's in the way of progress. And progress doesn't wait for anyone." Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was worse than he'd thought. Tom Matthews wasn't just a businessman, he was a predator, and he had set his sights on their home. Mark had thought that maybe, just maybe, there was room for negotiation. But there was no negotiation here. It was a fight. A fight for everything that mattered to him. "I'm not selling," Mark said, his voice firm. "And if you think for 1 second that I'll let you bulldoze my home, you're wrong. You'll have to go through me." Tom's eyes narrowed, but his smile never faded. "We'll see, Mr. Reese. We'll see how long that resolve lasts." Mark stood up, turning toward the door. Before he left, he turned to face Tom one last time. "I'll protect my family. I'll protect my home. And I'll fight you every step of the way." Tom's smile faltered, but he said nothing as Mark walked out of the office, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. As Mark stepped out into the cold, gray air, his thoughts were already turning to the next step. This was just the beginning. Tom Matthews may have thought he could intimidate Mark, but he had no idea who he was up against. Mark had a family to protect, and no matter how powerful Tom Matthews was, no matter how many people he had on his side, Mark wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He walked away from the office building with a new sense of purpose, ready to fight for everything that mattered. And this time, he wasn't alone. The cool morning air bit at Mark's skin as he walked back to his car, the weight of the conversation with Tom Matthews pressing heavily on his chest. As he drove back to the house, his mind raced, formulating plans, considering his next steps, and trying to quell the rising fear that threatened to overtake him. He knew that Tom wasn't going to back down easily, but Mark couldn't afford to let that intimidate him. His family was everything to him, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. It was a few minutes before Mark pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of the house providing him with a temporary sense of relief. But as he stepped out of the car, his thoughts immediately shifted back to the confrontation with Tom Matthews. Mark's chest tightened. He couldn't let his family's world be torn apart. Not again. "Milo," Mark called, his voice hoarse from the weight of the day. The dog immediately appeared at the door, tail wagging gently, his keen eyes locking on Mark. He could tell something was wrong, just as he always could. "Come on, boy," Mark murmured, kneeling to scratch behind Milo's ears. "It's time to get ready." The dog nudged him affectionately, but Mark's gaze was distant as he looked toward the house. Milo could sense the shift in Mark's emotions, and the dog's protective instincts flared. Without needing any more words, the dog moved close to Mark's side, following him into the house. Inside, Mark found Ella in the living room, coloring on the floor. Her small, chubby hands held a crayon in a firm grip as she concentrated hard on filling in the picture in front of her. Milo padded over to her, resting by her side, ever watchful. The house was calm, almost too calm, and it made Mark feel more anxious than ever. It was a calm before the storm, he realized, and the storm was coming. "Hey, sweetie," Mark said softly, walking over to her. Ella looked up with a smile, the innocence in her eyes a stark contrast to the chaos Mark felt swirling in his mind. "Hi, Daddy," she chirped, showing him her drawing. "Look, I colored the doggy." Mark smiled, his heart swelling at the sight of her, but it was quickly replaced with a sense of urgency. "That's beautiful, Ella. You're doing such a great job." Milo gave a soft woof as he nuzzled her side, and Ella giggled, hugging him. Mark stood back for a moment, watching them both. In this moment, everything felt right, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't stay that way. There was a fight ahead, and he wasn't going to let anyone take away the home they'd built. He moved to the kitchen, taking out a pen and paper, jotting down his thoughts as he formulated a plan. The more he thought about the situation, the more he realized how deeply entrenched Tom Matthews was in the community. He wasn't just some opportunist businessman, he was a man with connections. He had political ties, legal support, and money resources. Mark couldn't easily fight, but he wasn't going to fight with money. He was going to fight with everything else. Mark made a mental list of everything he needed to do. First, he would gather all the legal paperwork related to the house and property. If he was going to defend it, he needed to know exactly what he. Second, he needed to reach out to his lawyer. The legal battle would be complicated, but it wasn't impossible. Mark had to be strategic. He couldn't afford to react out of fear, but rather out of resolve. And lastly, he needed to ensure the safety of his family. It wasn't just about fighting Tom Matthews on a legal level. Mark's instincts told him that the man wasn't going to back down simply because they didn't want to sell. He had a feeling that Tom had more in mind. Something darker. Something more sinister. The next morning, Mark contacted his lawyer, Sarah Matthews, a friend he had known for years. She was known for her sharp legal mind, but more importantly, she was someone Mark trusted. He didn't want to go into this fight blindly. He needed to be prepared for whatever Tom was planning. "Sarah, it's Mark," he said as soon as she answered the phone. "I need your help. Something's going on. Someone's trying to force us out of our home." "Is this about the land deal?" Sarah asked, her tone serious. "Yeah, I don't think it's just about buying the land anymore. I think they're trying to intimidate us. And I'm not sure what's coming next. But I need to know my options." "I'll be over in an hour," Sarah replied. "I'm going to need to look over the paperwork, and I'll get to work on a strategy." Mark hung up the phone, feeling a small measure of relief. Having Sarah's expertise would make all the difference. But he knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war for his family's safety. As the day wore on, Mark and Sarah met to go over the legal details. She was thorough and efficient, sifting through the papers and providing him with the information he needed. But as they were discussing strategy, the doorbell rang. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. "I'll get it," Mark said to Sarah, his voice low. He felt a strange unease settle in the pit of his stomach as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, his eyes narrowed in surprise. Standing there was Tom Matthews. The man wore a smirk that made Mark's blood run cold. "I see you're hard at work, Miss Reese," Tom said, his voice smooth and self-assured. "I thought I'd come by and check on things. We really don't want this to get messy." Mark's instincts screamed at him to slam the door, to shut him out, but he couldn't. Not this time. "What do you want, Matthew?" Mark's voice was calm, but it was a struggle to keep the anger from spilling over. "Just making sure we're on the same page," Tom said, his smile never leaving his face. "I've already made my offer. It's a good one. The best you'll get, but we both know this won't end well if you continue to resist. You're making things harder for yourself and your family." Mark felt his fists tighten at his sides. "This is my home," he said, his voice cold. "I'm not selling, and if you try anything to push me out, I'll make sure the whole neighborhood knows exactly what kind of man you are." Tom stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Mark could hear. "You think you're the only one who can make life difficult. You don't know what I'm capable of. You've already lost the fight, Mark. It's only a matter of time before you realize it." Mark's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you," Tom smiled, though there was nothing warm about it. "You should be." With that he turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. Tom's words rang in his ears like a threat he couldn't shake. As the days passed, Mark found himself preparing for the work. He gathered everything he needed: property documents, legal papers, and evidence that would prove Tom Matthews' underhanded tactics. He spoke to neighbors, ensuring that they were aware of what was happening, and making sure they knew he wouldn't back down. But there was another part of him, a quiet voice that told him he needed to trust in the strength of his family. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had to stand firm, not just for himself, but for Ella, for Milo, for everything they had fought for. One evening, as the sky darkened and the air cooled, Mark sat on the porch with Milo, watching as the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the trees. Ella had gone to bed, and for a brief moment, the house felt peaceful, still, calm. Milo sat next to him,
his head resting on Mark's leg as they both looked out at the stars. In that quiet moment, Mark knew one thing for certain. No matter what Tom Matthews threw at him, no matter how hard the fight became, he would never let go of his family. He didn't know how long it would take, or how difficult it would be, but he would win. He would protect them. And nothing was going to tear them apart. The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. After Tom's ominous visit, everything felt heavier, more urgent. The quiet moments that had once been a source of peace now seemed full of tension. The threat that loomed over their home was no longer an abstract concept. It was real. Tom Matthews was not just a businessman. He was a force that Mark would have to reckon with. Someone who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Mark had spent every spare moment working on his strategy, poring over legal documents, consulting with Sarah, and speaking with his neighbors. It was a fight Mark never imagined he would have to face. But now that it was here, he had no choice but to fight with everything he had. One evening, after another long day of research and planning, Mark sat on the porch with Milo. Ella had fallen asleep inside, the soft sounds of her breathing coming through the open window. The night air was crisp, cool against his skin, but Mark barely noticed. He was lost in thought, his mind racing through the potential outcomes of the battle ahead. He knew that the stakes were higher than just a property dispute. This was about more than land. This was about his family's safety, their future, and their peace. Milo sat beside him, leaning his head against Mark's leg, his eyes scanning the yard, ever watchful. Mark couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude for the dog. Milo had been more than just a pet. He had been his shield, his protector, his constant companion. Through the darkest moments of their lives, Milo had been there, unwavering, never faltered. The bond between them was so deep. It was as if they shared an unspoken understanding of the world around them. "You know, Bud," Mark said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through. You've always been there for me. For Elle, you've never left us, no matter how hard things got. And I don't plan on letting you down now." Milo let out a soft whine, nudging Mark's hand with his nose, as if to offer his silent support. It was a comfort Mark desperately needed. Milo didn't need words to understand what Mark was feeling. The dog had always known what was needed, whether it was a quiet nudge, or an unwavering presence when the world seemed too dark. "Whatever happens," Mark continued, "we'll face it together. You, me, and Ella. No one is taking this family from us." The following morning brought a sense of unease that settled deep in Mark's gut. As much as he tried to prepare himself for the inevitable confrontation, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His thoughts kept returning to Tom Matthews. The smug smile, the veiled threats. Mark knew the man wasn't finished. He could feel it. It was mid-afternoon when Mark's phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway, his heart racing. "Mr. Reed." The voice on the other end was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Mark instantly recognized it as Tom Matthews' voice, though it was colder than before. "Yes?" Mark responded, his tone clipped. "I wanted to check in," Tom said. "I trust you've had time to think about my offer." "I've thought about it. And my answer is still the same. I'm not selling," Mark replied, his voice firm, though his heart raced in his chest. Tom chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You really don't understand the position you're in, do you? This isn't a negotiation. This is a formality. I'm trying to be patient with you, Mark, but you're making it harder than it needs to be." Mark felt a flash of anger flare up inside him, but he held it in check. He couldn't afford to show weakness. "If you think I'm just going to roll over and let you take this house, you're wrong. This is my home. My family's home. You'll have to go through me to take it." The silence on the other end was deafening. Mark could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, as if Tom was assessing whether or not to push further. Finally, the voice on the other end spoke again, cold and calculated. "We'll see about that, Mr. Reese," Tom said, his tone shifting from smooth to threatening. "You've made your choice, but remember, the world is full of options. I'm not the only one who can offer you a way out. If you refuse to cooperate, the consequences will be yours to bear." The line went dead before Mark could respond. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected the threats, but hearing them from Tom's lips, knowing how far he was willing to go, sent a shiver of fear down Mark's spine. The man wasn't just trying to buy the land, he was trying to break them, to push them out, no matter the cost. Mark's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white as the reality of the situation set in. He had no choice now. He had to fight with everything he had. Mark immediately called Sarah Matthews. The strategy needed to change. He couldn't afford to sit back and hope for a favorable outcome anymore. He needed to take action. Sarah, I just spoke to Matthews. He's not letting up, Mark said, his voice tight with frustration. I need to escalate this. We need to go public with this. I want the whole town to know who he really is. I want them to know what he's trying to do. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Mark could hear the sound of papers shuffling on her end of the line. I agree. We need to make this more public, but we have to be careful. We need to gather everything we can. Witness statements, legal filings, anything that will expose his tactics. This won't be easy, but I'll start working on it right away. Thank you, Sarah, Mark said, feeling a small measure of relief. He trusted Sarah, and he knew she would fight for them. We need to make sure he can't get away with this. I'll start reaching out to people in the community, Sarah said. We'll get the ball rolling, but you need to stay strong, Mark. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. I'm ready, Mark replied. I won't back down. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah and Mark worked tirelessly, pulling together the legal case, speaking with neighbors, gathering evidence. Mark spent every free moment ensuring that Ella and Milo were safe, but his mind was never far from the looming battle. Every night, after Ella had gone to bed, Mark would sit with Milo on the porch, watching the stars as he thought about everything that was happening. His conversations with Tom Matthews played over and over in his mind. The threats, the subtle intimidation. Mark wasn't naive. He knew that Tom had far more resources than he did, but he also knew one thing. His family would always come first. They had already survived so much, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from them. But as the pressure mounted, Mark could feel the toll it was taking on him. He was exhausted, mentally and physically. His body ached from the constant strain, his thoughts never fully at rest. He didn't talk about it to Ella. He didn't want her to see him as anything but a protector, but there were nights when the weight of everything threatened to crush him. Milo seemed to sense it. As always, the dog was ever by his side, offering the silent comfort Mark needed. When Mark would sit on the porch, Milo would rest his head on his lap, offering warmth and solace in the quiet moments of uncertainty. As the legal battle progressed, it became clear that things were escalating. Tom Matthews wasn't letting up. He increased his efforts to buy the land, using even more aggressive tactics. There were threats of legal action, of zoning changes, and the local government began to take notice. Mark knew that this wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. It was about power, and Tom was using every tool at his disposal to take control. The day of the final confrontation came sooner than Mark expected. Sarah had arranged a meeting with the town council to discuss the issue, and both Tom and Mark were invited to present their case. The tension in the room was palpable. Mark could feel the weight of every eye on him as he stood up to speak, with Milo by his side, always alert. He knew that this was his last chance. This wasn't just a legal argument. This was about his family's future. Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke. We've been through a lot, Mark began, his voice clear despite the pressure. But I won't let anyone take this from us. This is more than just a piece of land. This is our home. My wife and daughter live here. My dog lives here, and I'm not leaving. Not without a fight. He glanced at Tom, whose confident smirk was still there, but Mark saw a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes. It was small, but it was there. I'm asking you to stand with me, Mark said, his voice strong. Stand with me, and with every family in this town who deserves the chance to keep their homes. Don't let Tom Matthews and his company bulldoze our lives.
As he finished speaking, Mark felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to them. The room was silent as Mark finished speaking. Every pair of eyes in the town hall chamber seemed to be trained on him, watching, weighing his words. The council members sat in front of him, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Tom Matthews, seated across the room, watched with that ever-present smirk on his face. He was confident, unfazed. Mark had seen that expression before. Tom thought he had already won, but this time, Mark wasn't going to let that happen. As the final echoes of his voice faded, Mark took a slow, steady breath, standing tall, his shoulders squared. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the pressure of the eyes on him, the fear of what might happen if he failed, but he couldn't back down. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Tom Matthews leaned forward in his chair, crossing his arms, his posture casual yet assertive. "You make a compelling case, Mr. Reese," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "But the reality is, this land is not just yours to keep. The developers are already lined up, and we've got the backing of the city to do what needs to be done. We've offered you a fair price. There's no reason to drag this out." Mark's heart raced, but he didn't let his composure falter. He had prepared for this moment. He had spent weeks talking to neighbors, organizing with the community, gathering signatures from local families who felt the same way he did. The support was there, he just had to make them see it. "I'm not here to make a deal, Tom," Mark said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm here to make a stand. This land is more than just a piece of property to us. This is where my daughter plays. This is where my dog sleeps at night. It's where my family has built a life. You want to bulldoze that for profit, but you can't buy that, not from me, not from us." There was a murmur from the room as Mark spoke, the community's solidarity beginning to take shape. It wasn't just Mark standing up for his family. It was everyone in the room. Neighbors, people who lived and worked in the town, who had watched this same struggle unfold in other parts of the city. Mark felt a surge of hope, but he couldn't afford to be distracted. He had to keep his focus. This was far from over. Tom Matthews' smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing with impatience. He stood up, his movements smooth but deliberate, as though preparing for battle. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "This town is changing, Mr. Reed. You can either be a part of that, or you can stand in the way. But standing in the way never ends well for anyone." Mark's jaw tightened at the threat, but he refused to back down. "I won't let you destroy everything we've worked for, Tom," he replied, his voice steady. "This is my fight now, and I'll fight you with everything I have. I won't let you take my family's future." There was a long pause. The council members exchanged looks, some hesitant, others more resolute. Finally, one of the council members, a woman with glasses and short gray hair, spoke up. "I think we've heard enough," she said, her voice carrying authority. "We'll deliberate and vote on the proposal shortly. But Mr. Reese, I appreciate your passion. I can see how much you care for your home." Mark felt a brief flicker of hope, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. He knew that Tom Matthews had power connections that could sway the decision in his favor, but Mark had something more important on his side. The truth, the fight wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about the community and the families who had built lives here. Tom Matthews was an outsider, an opportunist, and the people of this town wouldn't forget that. As Mark left the town hall, the weight of the day seemed to crush him. The deliberation had gone on for hours, and while he had made his case, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tom Matthews had some kind of hidden advantage. As he made his way to the car, Milo trotting beside him, Mark's thoughts were consumed by the uncertainty of what would come next. He had done everything he could to prepare, but now it was out of his hands. When he got home, he found Ella sitting at the kitchen table, coloring, her concentration intense as she carefully filled in a picture of a dog. Mark smiled at her, trying to push the tension from his mind. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down beside her. "How was your day?" "Good, Daddy," Ella said with a bright smile, showing him her drawing. "Look, it's a doggy." Mark's heart swelled as he gazed at her drawing. It was nothing like the one he'd seen earlier, a little crooked, the colors outside the lines, but it was filled with the same joy and innocence that had drawn him to her in the first place. "You did an awesome job," Mark said softly, his voice filled with pride. Ella grinned and handed him the picture. "For you, Daddy." He took it, his heart aching with love. In the midst of all the uncertainty, the one thing that remained unchanged was this: Ella's love, her joy, and the peace she found in the simplest thing. She didn't know about the threats, the negotiations, the battle Mark was fighting on her behalf, But in her own way, she was reminding him why he was doing this. Milo sat at Mark's feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes alert as always. The dog had been by his side through every battle, both big and small, and Mark was reminded once again how lucky he was to have both of them in his life. Together they made him stronger. Together they were a team. "I'll make sure you and Mommy are always safe, sweetie," Mark whispered to Ella, his voice full of resolve. "You don't ever have to worry." Ella looked up at him with those innocent eyes, her trust unwavering. "I love you, Daddy." Mark's heart nearly broke with the weight of, "I love you too more than anything in this world." The following day, the town council convened to make their decision. Mark sat in the front row, his fingers tightly gripping the armrest of his chair. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Tom Matthews was sitting across the room, as confident as ever, but Mark could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. He was used to getting his way. Mark knew. He didn't like losing. The room was packed with local residents, friends, neighbors, people who had lived here for years. They had all come to show their support for Mark, but even with the crowd behind him, Mark felt like an outsider in this battle. This wasn't just about land or money. This was about the heart of the community, the families who called this place home. And no matter how powerful Tom Matthews was, Mark refused to let him win. The council members began to deliberate, and Mark's stomach tightened. He glanced at Milo, who sat by his feet, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. It was almost as if the dog understood the weight of the moment, his protective instincts on full alert. Mark gave him a reassuring scratch behind the ears, trying to calm himself. After what felt like an eternity, the council members began to speak. One by one, they gave their opinion. Some were in favor of Tom Matthews' proposal, citing the potential for economic growth and job creation. Others, however, spoke up for Mark, citing the importance of preserving the community and the needs of the families who had lived here for generations. Finally, after a long pause, the chairperson of the council, the woman who had spoken up for Mark earlier, stood and addressed the room. "After careful consideration, we have decided to reject the proposal from Matthews Enterprises," she said, her voice firm and clear. "This land will remain in the hands of the Reese family, and the town will not be sold to developers." Mark's heart soared as the room erupted in applause. He looked over at Tom Matthews, whose face had gone pale. The man's eyes were dark with anger, but there was no denying it now. Mark had won. The victory didn't feel like an end. Instead, it felt like a new beginning. The community had stood together, and the land would remain with the Reese family, preserved for future generations. But as Mark walked out of the town hall with Milo by his side, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. Tom Matthews would no doubt try to find another way to push him out, but Mark was ready for whatever came next. He had his family, he had his home, and he had the strength to fight for both. That night, Mark sat with Ella and Milo, watching as the sun set over their home. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He would face it with the people he loved, and together they would overcome anything. "You did it, buddy," Mark whispered to Milo, who sat contentedly at his side. "We did it." Milo nudged his hand with a soft woof, and Mark smiled, feeling the quiet strength of the dog's presence. With Milo and Ella beside him, Mark knew that no matter what came next, they would always stand together. The weeks following the town council's decision were quieter, but Mark knew this calm was fragile. The town had rallied behind him, and the property would remain in his hands, but there was an underlying tension he couldn't shake. Tom Matthews had been defeated, but Mark didn't fool himself into thinking this was the end. People like Tom didn't give up easily. The fight might have been won, but the war wasn't over. Still, Mark couldn't help but enjoy the peace. He spent the days focusing on his family, savoring the simple moments that had once been drowned out by fear and uncertainty. Ella's laughter, which had once been tinged with the shadows of the break-in, was now filled with joy and innocence. Milo, always by her side, had regained his playful spirit. The dog no longer seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, and Mark was grateful for it. The puppy, who had once been so small and vulnerable, had become the anchor of their home. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Mark sat on the porch, Milo by his side. Ella was inside, playing with her toys, her small voice rising in excitement, as she babbled to herself. Mark's heart swelled as he watched her through the window, her carefree joy a beautiful contrast to the heavy days of the past. You know, Milo, Mark said softly, looking down at the dog. I still can't believe it. I thought I was going to lose everything. I thought I was going to fail. Milo looked up at him with understanding eyes, his tail wagging slowly. The dog had always known when Mark needed comfort, and tonight was no different. Mark scratched behind his ears, letting out a slow breath. I thought I was going to lose Ella, lose this home, all the things I've worked for, Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. But you stood by me, Milo. You never gave up, even when I thought everything was falling apart. Milo let out a low, contented bark, nudging Mark's hand. Mark chuckled, his heart lightening. You're the best, buddy, he said, feeling the weight of his gratitude. Later that evening, after dinner, Mark found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edges of a family photo. Ella was asleep, her small body curled up in her Milo was lying at her feet, as always keeping watch. The quiet of the house was almost surreal. After all the chaos, the threats, the fear of losing everything, Mark was finally beginning to feel the peace he had longed for. He had spent so many nights lying awake, consumed by worry, by the uncertainty of what the future might bring. He had felt like he was fighting an invisible enemy, one that seemed to be everywhere, closing in on them. But now, with the town behind him, with his family safe, that weight seemed to be lifting. Mark had done what he needed to do. He had fought for his family, and they had won. But as he sat there, lost in thought, a flicker of doubt crept in. What if this wasn't the end? What if Tom Matthews wasn't done with him? What if the next attack wasn't as easy to fight off? Mark shook his head, forcing the thought from his mind. For now he needed to focus on the good, the love, the protection, the simple joy of being with his family. But a part of him couldn't help but stay vigilant, his mind always looking ahead, prepared for whatever came next. It was a few days later when Mark's phone rang again. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Mark didn't hesitate to answer. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, too low, with an air of authority that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Mr. Reese, the man said, his tone measured. I'm George Summers, an attorney with Matthews Enterprises. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What do you want? He asked, his voice tight with caution. I'm sure you've heard of our recent decision, George continued, his voice calm, even though Mark could hear the underlying tension. But there's another matter we need to address. We've made a new offer, a much higher offer than before. We think you'll want to reconsider. Mark's stomach turned. He had been expecting this. He had known that the moment he won the battle for his home, Tom Matthews wouldn't give up. But this new approach, an offer to buy the land at an even higher price, felt like a taunt, a challenge to his resolve. I'm not interested in selling, Mark said firmly, and I told Tom Matthews the same thing before. I'm not going to let you buy my family's future. There was a pause on the other end. Mark could almost hear George's smile, though it was as cold and calculating as ever. We'll see, Mr. Reese, George said, his voice clipped. We'll see how long you're willing to hold out when the pressure starts mounting. We can make life difficult. I'm sure you'll reconsider soon enough. The line went dead before Mark could respond. He sat in stunned silence for a moment, his heart racing. He had known it wasn't over, but hearing it from someone within Matthews Enterprises brought the fear rushing back. Mark leaned forward, his head in his hands. He had just won, hadn't he? The town had chosen him. The property was his, but this was no ordinary man he was dealing with. Tom Matthews wasn't the type to accept defeat, and now it seemed he was pulling out all the stops to try and break him, to break his resolve. Mark's thoughts turned to Ella and Milo. They were his everything. He wouldn't let them down. He had already fought for them once, and he was prepared to do it again. The days that followed were filled with tension. Mark didn't tell Ella about the call. He didn't want her to sense the fear that had crept back into his heart, but he knew he couldn't keep this from her forever. He had to act quickly. He needed to find a way to protect their home for good, to secure their future without falling prey to Tom Matthews's intimidation tactics. He reached out to Sarah Matthews once again. She had been invaluable during the first fight, but this new development meant they had to be more strategic. Sarah listened carefully as Mark explained the situation. We have to make sure Matthews can't threaten us like this again, Sarah said, her voice resolute. We can go on the offense. We need to start making more noise, publicize the issue more, reach out to the media, local leaders.
We need the whole town to see what Matthews is really doing. Mark nodded, a sense of clarity forming in his mind. He knew Sarah was right. They had won the battle, but they couldn't let Matthews keep pushing them around. It was time to expose him for who he really was. Over the next few weeks, Mark worked tirelessly, coordinating with Sarah, reaching out to the community, and ensuring that Matthews' tactics were publicly known. He made appearances at local meetings, speaking about what Matthews had tried to do to their family, to their town. Slowly but surely, more people began to rally behind him. The pressure mounted, and Matthews Enterprises found themselves on the defensive. The day of the final showdown came sooner than Mark expected. Matthews Enterprises had backed off for now, but Mark knew that Tom Matthews would never truly give up. The question was whether the community would continue to stand with him, or whether he would be forced to fight this battle again. He had done everything right, but Mark wasn't naive. He had seen people like Tom before, ruthless, determined, and willing to do whatever it took to win. It was a crisp autumn day when the final vote was held in town hall. The community had gathered once again, the same faces who had stood with him before. Mark was prepared for anything, but he had hope that the strength of the community would be enough to drive Matthews away for good. As the council deliberated, Mark stood by the window, Milo by his side. The dog's calm presence was the only thing keeping him grounded in that moment. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah standing beside him. "It's going to be okay, Mark," she said softly, though there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "You've fought for this, and you've got the whole town behind you. They can't break you." Mark nodded, his thoughts racing. No matter what happened in that room, he had already won. His family was safe. He had stood up for what was right, and with that he knew he could face whatever came next. The cool breeze swept through the town square as Mark stood outside the town hall, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. It had been months since Tom Matthews had first made his offer, and it had been an exhausting battle of wills ever since. But now today it was coming to a head. This was it, the final decision. Mark knew that whatever happened, this would be the last time they would face Matthews head-on. The town hall was crowded, the air thick with anticipation. Residents milled about, exchanging whispered words of encouragement and concern. Mark stood at the center, trying to hold on to the sense of calm he'd fought so hard to find. But the stakes were higher now than they had ever been before. It wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about his family, their future, and the community they had fought so hard to protect. Inside the town hall, the council members were already gathering, preparing for the vote that would determine the fate of his home. Tom Matthews was there too, standing in the back, his presence commanding and imposing. Mark could feel his eyes on him, the man's gaze sharp and calculating. Tom had lost before, but Mark knew it wasn't over for him. Not yet. As the doors to the council chambers opened, Mark walked inside, his steps purposeful. His heart beat loudly in his chest, but he steadied himself. He was not going to let fear take hold. He had already come too far to back down now. He had his family, he had his community, and he had the truth on his side. He took his seat at the front, facing the council with Milo at his side. The dog sat at his feet, ever watchful as always. Milo had been a constant presence throughout the entire ordeal, always by his side, a steady, silent protector. Mark reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, drawing strength from the simple gesture. He wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. The proceedings began with the usual formalities, but Mark barely registered the words spoken. His mind was focused on the vote that would follow. Tom Matthews sat across from him, his smug expression still as sharp and calculated as ever. The man was unshaken by the pressure, his confidence unwavering. He had made his offer, tried to buy the land, and when that didn't work, he had used every legal and psychological tactic he could think of to force Mark into submission.
But Mark wasn't about to let that happen. Not now, not after everything he'd been through. This battle had tested him in ways he never imagined. But it had also shown him something vital: the strength of his community. The unity that had formed between him and his neighbors was something more powerful than any amount of money. And it was that strength, that bond, that would carry them through today's vote. The council members began their deliberation, one by one. Each spoke in turn, weighing the pros and cons of Tom's proposal, considering the impact it would have on the town, its residents, and its future. Mark had hoped for this. He had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the people who mattered most, the residents, the ones who lived here, who worked here would have their voices heard. As the final council member spoke, the chairperson called for a vote. Mark's hands were clammy, his heart thundering in his chest. The room was silent as the council members cast their ballots. Mark sat back in his chair, his breath shallow. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the results were tallied. The chairperson stood, her face unreadable. "The vote has been counted," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "By a majority, the proposal to sell the land to Matthews Enterprises has been rejected." For a moment, Mark couldn't breathe. His mind spun, trying to process the words. Then the reality of it hit him. The town had chosen him. The land was his. His home, his family's future, was safe. A slow wave of relief washed over him, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room erupted into applause. He stood up, his knees weak with emotion, but he held his ground. The decision had been made. They had won. But as the applause continued, Mark glanced over at Tom Matthews. The man was still seated, his face pale with rage, his jaw clenched tightly, and for the first time since Mark had met him, Tom Matthews looked vulnerable, human. Tom's eyes locked onto Mark's, and in that moment, Mark knew it wasn't over. The man would never forgive him for this, but that didn't matter. Not anymore. The days that followed were a blur of relief and celebration. The town was buzzing with excitement, and Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had fought for his family, for his home, and for the community, and now they were safe. For the first time in a long time, Mark allowed himself to relax. He spent the next few days with Ella and Milo, enjoying the quiet moments he had longed for. He and Ella spent time in the backyard, picking flowers and playing games, while Milo ran around them, his tail wagging with joy. But despite the victory, the threat wasn't entirely gone. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Tom Matthews wasn't done yet. He had made it clear that he wouldn't stop. And as Mark sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset with Milo by his side, he couldn't ignore the nagging sense of unease that still lingered in his chest. It was then that he realized that this fight, this battle to protect his family, had changed him. The man who had walked into this ordeal months ago, unsure and fearful, had become someone stronger, more resilient. He had learned what it meant to fight for something greater than himself. He had learned to trust his community, to lean on the people around him, and to stand firm in the face of fear. Milo looked up at him, his eyes full of understanding. The dog had been there for him through everything. The sleepless nights, the tense meetings, the fear of losing it all. Mark reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the weight of the bond between them. Milo was more than just a pet. He was family, a constant presence in the storm that had been Mark's life over the past few months. "Thank you, buddy," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were right there when I needed you most. I couldn't have done this without you." Milo wagged his tail, nudging Mark's hand as if to say, "We're in this together." And in that moment, Mark knew that no matter what came next, he wasn't alone. He had Ella, he had Milo, and he had the strength of his community behind him. The weeks passed and life in the town slowly returned to normal. The media attention faded, and the threat of Tom Matthews, though still lingering in the back of Mark's mind, seemed less pressing. It wasn't that Mark was complacent. He knew that Tom could still find a way to challenge them again, but for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. The victory was real, and the future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. Ella continued to grow, her laughter filling the house as she learned new words and new games. Mark was there for every step, every moment. Milo, ever the watchful protector, was always by her side, ready to play, to comfort, and to guard. One afternoon, as Mark sat in the backyard, watching Ella and Milo run through the grass, he realized something profound. He had been so focused on the battles, the challenges, and the fight to protect them, that he had nearly forgotten what they were fighting for. They weren't just fighting to keep their home, they were fighting for moments like this, simple, peaceful moments, with the people they loved. As the sun set on another quiet evening, Mark sat back in his chair, a smile creeping onto his face. The war wasn't over. Not entirely, but for the first time, he could see the path ahead. He had won, and now, with Milo by his side, and Ella growing up before him, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with everything he had. Together they were unstoppable. Weeks turned into months, and life in the small town began to settle into a rhythm. Mark had thought that the victory over Tom Matthews would bring a sense of finality, a feeling of peace where everything was safe, protected, and in its place. And yet, as time passed, he realized that peace was not something you simply achieved. It was something you maintained, something you chose every day. He spent his days with Ella, watching her grow from a toddler into a young child, each new day bringing new discoveries, new lessons. She had become a source of strength for him, her laughter the music that kept his heart beating steady, even during the toughest moments. And Milo, his loyal companion, was still by their side, ever watchful, ever devoted, always offering comfort with his soft gaze or gentle presence. Mark often reflected on how far they had come. There had been times when he wasn't sure they would make it through the storm. The weight of fear, the anxiety of losing everything, had threatened to crush him. But now, looking out over the backyard, Ella running around with Milo, the dog playfully chasing her, both of them laughing as the sun set in the distance, Mark knew it had all been worth it. The fight for their home, their safety, their future. He had been tested, but he had found something in himself he didn't know existed: a resilience, a strength, a will to protect the ones he loved at all costs. It wasn't just about a house. It had never been just about the land. It was about preserving a sense of belonging, a place where love could grow, where memories could be made, and where his family could thrive without fear. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with Milo at his side, he watched Ella and the dog run through the grass, their joyful energy radiating in the warm glow of the setting sun. The simple beauty of the moment almost took his breath away. He had fought to preserve these moments, to ensure that this sense of peace, this innocence, would remain untouched. Milo trotted over and sat beside him, resting his head on Mark's knee, his eyes full of understanding. It had been Milo's steadfast loyalty that had helped Mark through the darkest days, reminding him that the things that mattered most were right there in front of him: his family, his home, and the love that kept them strong. "Thanks, buddy," Mark said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were right here, every step of the way." Milo's tail gave a slow, steady wag, as if to acknowledge the unspoken bond between them. Mark's eyes shifted to Ella, who was laughing as Milo gently nudged her with his nose, guiding her toward a new game. She looked up at him and smiled, her bright, trusting eyes filled with the wonder of the world. Mark's heart swelled with love, and in that moment, he knew he had given everything he could to protect this life, this love. The fight had been hard, and the future was always uncertain, but he had won the most important battle of all. He had secured a safe home for his family. As the seasons changed, and the town slowly returned to normal, Mark began to realize that the victory he had fought so hard for wasn't just about defeating Tom Matthews. It was about building something that would last: a legacy of resilience, of love, and of unwavering determination. Mark spent more time with his neighbors, helping out with community events, making sure that the relationships that had been forged during the battle would continue to grow. The strength of their small town was in the connections they had with each other. No one was an island, They were all part of something bigger, something worth protecting. Ella continued to grow, and Mark watched as she transformed from the innocent child she had once been into a young girl full of potential and promise. Milo, too, had grown older, but his devotion to Mark and Ella had never wavered. The dog was still the protector, the guardian, the constant reminder of the bond that had kept them safe. Mark knew that, as time went on, new challenges would arise. Life was unpredictable, after all. But he had learned something invaluable from this journey: that as long as he had his family, his community, and the love that bound them all together, nothing could take away the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. One evening, several years later, Mark stood in front of the house, with Ella by his side, their hands clasped together. Milo was lying at their feet, looking up at them, with his loyal, loving eyes. The house had been repaired, the once worn foundation now solid, the memories of the past battles still lingering, but no longer haunting them. They had built a life here together. Mark smiled as he looked at his daughter, watching as she skipped across the yard, calling out for Milo to follow her. "I think we've done it," Mark whispered to himself. "We've created a home." Ella looked up at him with that same bright smile, the one that always melted his heart. "What? Daddy, we've made it," Mark said, bending down to her level and placing a hand on her shoulder. "We've built a life here, a life that's ours, and I'll never let anything take that from us." Ella nodded, as if she understood everything he meant. though she was still so young. She wrapped her arms around him in a hug, and Mark held her tight, savoring the moment. This was the culmination of everything. The fight, the fear, the struggle, all of it had led him to this moment, this quiet victory. And in that embrace, Mark knew one thing with absolute certainty. The future was theirs to shape, and as long as they had each other, they could face anything the world threw at them. Milo let out a soft woof, as if to remind them that they weren't alone, that their journey was far from over, but that together, they would continue to thrive. Mark's heart was full, knowing that they were stronger than ever. They were a family, bound together by love, resilience, and an unbreakable bond, and nothing, no one, could ever take